As we return live to the capital, and David Dimbleby.
Tonight we're in London. We've had the debates, we've had the manifestos. It's now 3 weeks until decision day. And this is Question Time. And a big welcome to listeners, to viewers, to our audience here, and to our panel, the Conservative Party Chairman, Grant Shapps, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, the SNP leader at Westminster, Angus Robertson, the Liberal Democrat Business Minister, Jo Swinson, UKIP's Douglas Carswell, and the broadcaster and journalist, Piers Morgan. And just a reminder, as ever, you may already be texting and tweeting, but our hashtag BBCQT, you can follow us at BBC Question Time. 83981 is the number to tweet, and the red button tells you what people are saying. Let's just deal with the earlier events tonight, briefly, with a question from Laura Webster, please. Laura Webster.
In the event of a hung parliament, who is more dangerous for the UK, UKIP or SNP?
Both topics that were touched on. Which is the more dangerous? All right, Douglas Carswell, you begin.
I don't think UKIP's dangerous at all. I think what we need in this country is far-reaching change. We've had Tweedledee and Tweedledum politics for as long as anyone can remember. And frankly, many people that I represent in my part of Essex, and I think right across the country, are fed up with it. And what we're beginning to see here is something quite exciting. People realise that politics doesn't have to be like this, and people are starting to vote for change. And I think if we had a strong bloc of UKIP MPs in Parliament in just over a month's time, I think we could ensure that the priorities of the political elite in Westminster were changed and recalibrated, and so they reflected the concerns of ordinary people. And I think that would be incredibly positive for the country, and I think it can be done.
And UKIP, according to Nigel Farage, UKIP only really, as long as they get this referendum on Europe, they're up for it. Doesn't matter much what else goes on.
I wouldn't want UKIP to be in a coalition in with any government, because that means becoming part of the government, and I'm not in UKIP or politics because I want to be a minister or have a red box. I want change for my country. I think UKIP could support another party if that party was willing to bring about real change. And there are 3 or 4 things that I would insist upon, and I think UKIP would insist on. One is, as the name suggests, a free and fair referendum on the Europe question. But I think in addition to that, I would have grave difficulty in having confidence in any government that wasn't prepared to countenance real far-reaching political reform, including electoral reform, the power to recall MPs, and all sorts of other things that I think we need to change.
Well, that was a longer list than your leader gave earlier this evening. But anyway, there we are. Angus Robertson, you heard the spat. No, it wasn't the spat. The debate, the fierce debate between your leader and Ed Miliband about the conditions. She wanted what she called more progressive policies. We can keep the Tories out, and then we'll support you. Is that that's the line?
Well, there's a challenge for the Labour Party, isn't there? If the voting public decide that they're not going to give a majority to either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, and that's what every single opinion poll has showed in recent months, the Labour Party will have a decision to make whether it is going to be prepared to work with the SNP or whether it's going to allow David Cameron into government. We are absolutely clear. We do not want to see the Tories in government. I obviously would rather see Scotland self-governing and Nicola Sturgeon as our head of government, but that's not on offer in this Westminster general election. But what is happening in Scotland is profound at the moment, and people are turning their backs on the old UK parties. The Labour Party vote is going through the floor. The Liberal Democrats are disappearing, and as we know, there is only one Conservative MP in the whole of Scotland. So we have an opportunity to argue from a strong Scottish perspective in Westminster if we get the result that people are expecting. But we can also contribute by working together with other political parties to have a different kind of politics. And I reflect on the debate that took place in London as we are meeting here this evening, where amongst the largest round of applause from an audience in London was on this very question: why will the Labour Party not work with the SNP if it gives the opportunity of a different kind of politics that says no to austerity, let's do things differently? Why would they let the Tories back in? And that's a question for Yvette Cooper.
All right, well, we'll come to Yvette in just a moment. The man there. Thank you. Second row.
I think given the polling ratings, UKIP are unlikely to play a large role. They're predicted to get only 2 or 3 seats. But I think what's more worrying, and you tried yourself, David, was the lack of openness with Ed Miliband, and I'm sure the Conservatives would have been the same in kind of admitting they are highly likely not to get a majority government, and they're not willing to accept they are going to have to form a coalition. And it's worrying that they don't seem to be even considering a contingency plan in forming a coalition.
One for you, Yvette Cooper.
Well, I think to go back to the original question from Laura was...
And including his.
Yeah, and to respond to that as well. Who is the most dangerous? I think both are, because both the SNP and both UKIP want to divide us and want to pull us apart. So you've got the SNP who want to divide our nation, pull Scotland away from the rest of the United Kingdom. You have UKIP who want to divide us within our communities. And both of those, I think, would be deeply destructive for Britain. It's significant, though, that we're talking about UKIP and the SNP after the debate, because David Cameron wasn't there, and he wasn't there to defend his record. I think, frankly, that was really quite pathetic. He should have been there to answer questions, to answer for his record. And I do hope that he will take up Ed Miliband's offer now of a one-to-one debate, because that's what we really need, is to see the Prime Ministers the people who are standing to be Prime Minister of this country to go head-to-head, and we need to see that debate. But you asked as well about, you know, what the consequences would be in terms of the points that Angus made. I think, look, the SNP are saying that they don't want a Tory government, but they're asking people to vote SNP as a gamble on not getting a Tory government. Because in the end, by voting SNP, they're actually going to make it more likely that you'll get the Tories having the largest party. And so the only way in the end to guarantee getting a Labour government and not having David Cameron walk back into number 10 is to have a Labour vote for the Labour Party.
We don't live in a presidential system, Yvette. It is who can command a majority in the House of Commons that it gets the shot on forming the government. The SNP winning lots of seats in Scotland is a great thing from a Scottish point of view, but the numbers between the SNP and the Labour Party will remain the same. And if between us we can command a majority in the House of Commons, another government can be formed. But and you shouldn't explain something which is incorrect. People need to understand the way the Westminster system actually works. And it is up to your party in these circumstances to be honest to the voters in Scotland and say whether you are prepared to work with us or whether you're prepared to see David Cameron going back into government.
But you
and I tell you something, the Labour Party will be
on
finished,
David Cameron going back into number 10. Because you are telling people in England to vote Green, you are telling people in Wales to vote Plaid. In fact, you're telling people to vote everything other than Plaid. And then you're saying that you want Labour to be a bigger party.
Still haven't answered the question,
dishonest with people. There is a massive difference between us that's hugely important. In the end, I think we should have solidarity between England, Wales and Scotland.
Are you prepared to let David Cameron back into government?
We should care as much about children in poverty in Aberdeen as we do in Bethnal Green, because in the end we are stronger if we stand together than if we leave people to sink or swim alone.
Are you prepared to let David Cameron back into government?
Let's hold it now. Wait a minute. Keep your hands up and I'll come to you. Keep your hands up if you want to speak and I'll come to you in just a moment. But let's just hear Grant Shapps, Chairman of the Conservative Party, on the challenge Yvette made. Why won't they, as Ed Miliband said, why the two leaders of the two biggest parties won't debate?
Well, there was a format of debates. There are 4 different debates, and I think the clue was probably in the name of this one. But there are. And David Cameron's been in the first 2, he's in the last one. The clue's in the name of this one. It was the Challengers debate.
It was not the Challengers debate. It was not. It was called the BBC debate.
Okay.
It was never called the Challengers debate. It was... I'm sorry. You may have called it the Challengers debate, but that wasn't.
Well, one thing is clear. One thing is clear. There were 4 different debates. It was organised and negotiated by the broadcasters themselves. Hold on, by the broadcasters themselves. And as I say, actually, I don't think the Prime Minister was actually invited to the particular debate. So whatever it was called, he wasn't invited along. It's very hard for him to be there.
He ran away. Well, will he do the next one?
Yeah, he's in the next one.
Will he do the one-to-one, head-to-head with Ed Miliband? Yes, you came along today, and we appreciate it, Grant. We're really pleased to see you. But why won't David Cameron come?
It's very nice of you, Yvette. The point is that he is actually in the next one. He was in the last 2. And the reality of the situation is, I think we learnt quite a lot from that 90-minute debate this evening. I thought it was complete...
Well, not from you lot.
I thought it was... That's true. I thought it was complete and utter chaos. You could see what this was like. That was 90 minutes of chaos. And I thought Nicola Sturgeon, frankly, ran rings around Ed Miliband. You got a preview of what it would be like with Ed Miliband propped up by the SNP in Downing Street, demanding all sorts of things from Britain. It's why the answer to the original question would be the SNP are incredibly dangerous to this country for two reasons. One, they actually want to break up this country, and I think that is terrible. And secondly, because they will prop up an Ed Miliband government, and you would be the people who end up paying for all of that.
All right. Joe, I'll bring you in a moment. Let's just go outside the Westminster box and bring in Piers Morgan, and then I will come across to you, and then I'll come to you, Joe, too.
Well, I just think this conversation so far sums up the complete farce of this election. Like, nobody seems to know who we should be voting for to get anyone elected. None of the parties have any leader inspiring any confidence in any of us to vote for them in a majority. I don't know which one of you wants me to vote where or for whom. You can't be bothered to turn up to any of the debates. You talk about people being propped up, and yet you rely on that little irrelevant lapdog, Nick Clegg, right, who is seeing his... Well, I'm sorry, but he is irrelevant. His name was mentioned once tonight, almost by mistake. You know, this is a guy who now sits there and says, well, I'm in charge, I'm the one pulling all the shots. No, you're not. Your vote is disintegrating. Your seats are going to be at least halved. Nobody cares about you and your party because last time you had the chance, you jumped into bed with the wrong people and you... I was going to say a naughty word, but I won't. You went with the wrong people and you alienated probably half your audience. And, you know, I would urge everyone watching this tonight to listen very carefully to all the statistics we're going to get bombarded with here. Because I'm now at the stage of selection where I don't believe a single thing any of them are promising me. Not a thing. And what concerns me is the democratic process in this country now, where we now have suddenly, apparently, after 5 years of this weird hybrid government, we're now being told that at the last minute we can pull out of the hat 8 billion for the NHS and billions for this and billions for that. We're rolling in it, apparently, after all this austerity, and it's all complete claptrap.
All right, fine. Joe Swinson.
Well, I mean...
Liberal Democrat.
What can I say? I'm hurt. There was me thinking that you were going to be a dead cert Liberal Democrat voter at this election.
I might have been. I might have been if you hadn't done what you did on tuition fees. I've got 3 kids who've all gone through higher education, and they looked at Nick Clegg at the last election, and he promised them, "I will get rid of tuition fees." And what did he do? He trebled them. Well, he trebled them.
Hang on. We don't want a one-man recruitment drive here.
To his credit, Nick's held up his hands and says that we got it wrong on that. But what we have also...
What we do?
Hold on, Piers. Just wait. You've got plenty of time. Come on.
What we've also done is things that were on the front page of our manifesto last time. We've raised the income tax threshold so that people aren't paying any income tax on the first £10,000 they've earned. We're spending £2.5 billion extra through our pupil premium to support the poorest pupils. And there's 2 million more jobs in the economy. So actually we have achieved quite a lot in government. But to answer Laura's question,
which was UKIP or the SNP,
exactly.
Which is more dangerous?
So I think, and the debate I think showed this tonight, both are incredibly dangerous. What we saw there was a lack of in that debate tonight was any kind of centrist, sensible, responsible voice. You had the different extremes, which shows you the potential futures the country could go down, either in one route, going down a sort of extreme of just borrowing and borrowing ever more to pay for what sound like very lovely populist spending pledges, but ultimately don't have the economic responsibility that we need. Or you have the prospect of a Conservative-led government held ransom by Nigel Farage and this ideological desire to just keep on cutting even after the books have been balanced. That's why you actually need Liberal Democrats. We should have had Liberal Democrats in the debate tonight. And because of the Conservatives' refusal to take part, we didn't have that important, responsible voice tonight in the debate.
Right. So David Cameron said Nick Clegg wasn't allowed to go, so no. Nick Clegg said, OK, I better not go.
No, because the broadcasters... No, Yvette, that's not a fair characterisation. Nick Clegg was more than happy to turn up. The broadcasters tried to do a deal to make sure that there was at least one debate that David Cameron might agree to take part in, and as a result, that's the format that we got. Right. It was the broadcasters' choice, led by the Prime Minister refusing to turn up.
The gentleman there, and a number of other people have come to you.
I'm a UKIP member, and I think for anyone to
You're a UKIP member?
I'm a UKIP member, and I think for people to call UKIP dangerous shows that they're a Labour supporter, and I think for people to call SNP shows that they're quite a Tory supporter because one of them's going to prop up each other's governments. And like Piers said, with Nick Clegg being, I think, polling below UKIP at the minute, I think the question is why is Nigel Farage not on the Question Time special about with the other leaders?
Yeah. On the one in a fortnight's time?
Yeah.
Right, OK, well, let's not go into the parties have agreed, let's just establish that. However it came about, and it was obviously very complicated, all the parties have agreed to the 4 events that are taking place. It's a bit late to start saying.
I do believe there is a petition, though, challenging that, and it has got a lot of signatures.
Yeah, no, and he's going to be on later on that night, because we're very careful to balance the... Forget it for the moment. Let's get on with the subject, which was... you, sir, up there with the spectacles. Yeah, you in the middle. In the middle there, yes. No, the man on the right there with spectacles. You can see there, look. Keep your hand up till they find you. There we are. You, yes. Go on then, now shoot.
My question is, the 2 main parties don't seem to want to tell the electorate what cuts they're going to make. Why won't you tell us? And, you know, please can you, so we can make an informed decision?
I'm told you haven't got spectacles.
I haven't,
no. You need spectacles.
All right. Clear vision. What was the question again? Yvette Cooper.
You've had a long evening.
Yvette Cooper.
We've said, look, we've got to bring the deficit down year on year. You've got to balance the books, but you've got to do so in a balanced way. So what the Tories have set out...
What cuts are you going to make?
What UKIP have said they will support is more extreme cuts in the next few years than we have had in the last few years, and I think that is deeply damaging. So we've said we will make the deficit come down, and we'll do that in a balanced way. And that means you need to do 3 things. First of all, you need to have a fair deal on tax, which includes, for example, increasing the top rate of tax, the highest rate of tax, back up to 50 pence, which the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats supported them, and that's given tax cuts to millionaires. I think that's unfair.
That's a short-term measure, isn't it?
And there's other areas...
Sorry, is that just...
Cuts in public spending.
Is that a short-term measure, as Chukwuemeka said it was?
We've set it out. This is our plan for the Parliament. It will be throughout the Parliament. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do.
He was wrong.
This is the whole Parliament, absolutely.
Right, okay.
Secondly, there will have to be cuts in some department spending, and we've said that. We've already identified, for example, in the Home Office budgets, there are areas where you can make savings, put those back into the front line. For example, we should abolish police and crime commissioners, put that into frontline policing, a whole series of areas like that. That's about £800 million where you can identify savings.
Okay.
But we would also make sure that you get the economy growing, and so that you get the proceeds of growth. Now, what the Tories have done instead is said, such an extreme plan, you will have twice the pace of cuts in the next 12 months as we've had in the last. That is going to be devastating, whether it's for our National Health Service, our public services as well.
OK, yes. Hold on.
I can set out some more. We can go through police and crime commissioners. We can say some more if you want to.
I've got you. You could stand up and read the manifesto till the rest of the programme is over, but I don't want you to do that. I want to... But since we're on that, I'm going to take the question from Darren Gange, is it? Yep. And I'll bring you in, Douglas. I'm just about to bring you in. Darren Gange.
With a hung Parliament expected at the end of this election, can we trust any of the party's recent spending promises will be kept?
And this goes absolutely to the heart of what we hear over and over again on Question Time. How do we know that what they're promising is what they'll do? Douglas Carswell.
Darren, unlike the Westminster establishment parties, we've come up with a manifesto that we gave to an independent third-party organisation, the Centre for Economic and Business Research, and we asked them to vet it. And they went through our numbers, and they've signed off, and they've approved it. You may agree with our numbers, you may disagree with our numbers, but it's credible and it's costed. And we're able to say where we're going to cut public spending and how we're going to recalibrate priorities. We're going to cut public spending on things like overseas aid, on things like HS2, on things like the Barnett formula. We're going to reduce the number of government departments in Whitehall. Because we're committed to doing that, we're going to be able to spend money and afford tax cuts. We're going to be able to spend an extra £3 billion on the NHS. We think, unlike the establishment parties, who are talking about £8 billion from the magic money tree, we're talking about real money because we've outlined in detail where we're going to make those cost reductions.
Right. Can I ask you a question on that? I mean, let's just... because the question is about whether you really, really mean it. Would you refuse to support a Conservative government if it was not prepared to scrap the Barnett formula, which gives more to Scotland and Wales than it does to England? I mean, it's easy to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do the other, but would you do that?
I couldn't have confidence in a government that was going to pile debt and more debt onto our children and our grandchildren.
I asked you about
we have to get to grips with it. We have to get to grips with it now.
I asked you about the Barnett formula.
Yeah, that has to be changed. Right. Absolutely.
Angus Robertson.
I think there is greater honesty needed about where our cuts going to fall, because we've heard a lot of words, but we've not actually heard any details. And the thing that worries me is that the people who are going to suffer most in the next Parliament are the people who are least able to manage with those cuts, and those are the poorest in our society. I sat in the House of Commons and I watched Yvette and I watched Joe vote with the Tories on a £30 billion austerity proposal in January of this year. And we are now being told that somehow there's a massive difference in the plans between the Labour Party and the Tory party. That is not true. That is misleading. And we need to confront the fact that although the UK is one of the wealthiest states in the world, we have people lining up at food banks. We have projections of more than 1 million new children in poverty by 2020 if this goes ahead. We need a lot more honesty about where the cuts are going to fall. I know where I would make a big cut, and that is by not spending £100 billion renewing Trident weapons of mass destruction that we could never use. Okay. There's a straight answer to a straight question. You deserve it from the others on the panel.
But that would actually be a classic example of why they would be so dangerous. You know, my brother's a serving officer in the British Army, and it is right to say right now, there's probably never been a more dangerous period for the military around the world, not least of which our own. And to remove our nuclear deterrent at this time is absolutely crackers.
Well said.
And,
well said.
And let me explain why it's crackers very quickly. It's crackers because we are a stable country. Despite their best collective efforts, we are a stable country. We are economically reasonably prosperous compared to many other countries. But there are countries around the world that have nuclear power that are deeply unstable, Pakistan and others. And we have to be strong right now. We have to be strong with our allies, and we have to have a deterrent that works. I listened to them tonight. Even Ed Miliband said, well, I would keep Trident, but he wouldn't press the button. Well, what kind of deterrent is that? If you're watching that, you're thinking, let me get this straight. This guy's Prime Minister of Great Britain, Prime Minister of his country, and he said he's in charge of the nuclear trigger, he wouldn't ever press it? That's not a deterrent.
That's not what he said, Piers.
That is what he said. That is what he said. He said no. He said I wouldn't press it.
He was being asked whether he would get rid of Trident, and he said
well,
no,
the implication that I got from what he said, no, if he was asked would he press the button, he said no. Go back and check the transcript. I checked it. And the reality of that and the position of the SNP and the others who want to get rid of it is you would weaken this country at a time when we least need to be weakened.
All right, Grant Shapps.
Yeah, the actual question was actually about spending promises, I think, rather than the cuts per se. And the reason why I would say that the Conservatives, if elected with an overall majority, which, by the way, requires 11,200 people to vote differently in just 23 seats, so I reject the idea that there has to be a coalition government. We're absolutely going for an outright majority. Would be on the basis that we've done what we said we were going to do this time. So, for example, that income tax threshold, you don't pay any tax now till £10,600, that's been raised. The fact that we're promising now to raise that to £12,500, yeah, well, we've done it in this Parliament, so it can be done again. The fact that we've pledged to spend £8 billion, it sounds a lot more a year on the National Health Service, is because anyone here who's been treated by the NHS, their lives have been saved, happened to me, I'm sure it's happened to other people here.
About you.
Anyone who,
it's
let me just explain this point.
No, Darren's question wasn't about you, the Tories, it was about a hung Parliament.
No, but the point...
and how much of the things you're now describing would last through a coalition, say, with the Liberal Democrats again, which is a possibility. But I think a bit of UKIP help.
But I think it's a fair point to challenge the assertion behind the question. There does not need to be a hung Parliament. Conservatives only require 23 more seats. Labour, on the other hand, would require about 70 seats, more if they lose out to the SNP in Scotland. So I don't agree that there needs to be a coalition.
No,
and I do,
nor does Labour, for that matter.
But you look at the figures, they have to win a lot more. And I would point this out. We've given to this NHS each year, by the end of the Parliament, £7 billion more a year. We're saying that by the end of the next Parliament, we'll do what the Chief Exec of the NHS, Simon Stevens, wants, which is another £8 billion, at least £8 billion. We've said we'll do that. You can believe it because we've done it in this Parliament.
And I will come to more people in a moment, but Yvette Cooper, can you just clarify the thing that Angus Robertson said, which is always being said, oh, well, you went into the lobbies, the Liberal Democrats into the lobbies with the Tories for £30 billion worth of cuts. What was that?
There was no £30 billion in the motion at all. What we voted for is exactly what we said in our manifesto, which is we will need to bring the deficit down year on year. It's a sensible thing to do. We have to balance our books and live within our means. But we need to hang on a second.
No, but hang on. But Angus, do you withdraw what you say?
We need to do this.
The SNP keeps saying this. And
No, but it's rubbish. Where was the 30 billion in the motion?
I'm sure Grant Shapps can confirm, because he was in the lobby with Yvette Cooper when she voted for that very same motion.
What did they vote for?
All three parties voted for £30 billion of what's called consolidation over the next 2 years, but it's untrue when Yvette says they will balance the books. That's not what they plan to do. By the end of the next Parliament, we'll still be
I think we've had enough on that. I think it's a disputed point, and we can't sort it out.
There was no £30 billion in this motion at all. What we voted for was our sensible, balanced plan. What Grant wants to do is to cut £40 billion from spending alone, from departmental spending alone, in the next 3 years, and then he's got another 25 billion of unfunded promises on top of that. The idea, you have got no way that you're going to come up with the money, whether it's for the National Health Service, whether it's for your right to buy, or for anything. You are just panicking.
Look at this audience. You have completely lost the audience. Look. We're all just sitting there. We're all sitting there going, what are they talking about?
Let's recover our audience with the man without spectacles in the green check shirt there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to say there's a lot of confusion about who to vote for, who not to vote for. Yvette's telling us we shouldn't vote SNP because if we vote SNP, we won't get a Labour government, whatever. You know, I don't expect Michael's party to agree with voter reform either, because he's saying he needs an overall majority of a few thousand more votes, when really he needs another 20% of the electorate to vote for him. None of us know who we're wanting to vote for. If we vote for the Greens, it's wasted. If we vote for whoever, it's wasted. Why don't we have a voting system, like, I don't know, single transferable vote or open list system, where none of our votes...
Very good. And you say,
I just think that listening to some of this is pretty laughable tonight. We've got the SNP and the nationalist parties and UKIP being talked of as extremists. This is ridiculous. They're not extremists at all compared to what we've seen in history. I think what we're here is effectively we've got the political establishment, the people in the middle are just fighting to save their own skin, and we can see that people who are outside of the centre, be it left, be it right, all over Europe, look at Syriza and Podemos, Front National in France, people over Europe are fed up with this. It's not just in the UK, and I think all this arguing over the middle ground is missing the point about what so many people in the UK and across Europe actually want.
I think listening to... I think you're right. Listening to Yvette and Grant squabbling tonight is a pretty good advertisement for why we need far-reaching and fundamental change. I personally have come around to the view that we need electoral reform, and I think we need electoral reform precisely so that the people who get to the top of the parties in Westminster never forget that it's the voters who are their boss. And unfortunately, we've got a political system today where people get to the top of their parties and they completely lose touch and they squabble amongst each other and they regard politics as a parlour game, clever tactics, but they've completely lost sight of the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of voters who are left cold by it.
Jo Swinson.
Well, I think that, obviously, I will agree with the excellent comment from the audience about the merits of single transferable vote and that we do need to do our politics differently. And I think, actually, you can have quite a mature conversation that sometimes I think in politics there's a fear that somehow voters won't understand. But, I mean, the premise of Darren's question is a really important one, that if we end up in a situation, as looks very likely, where there is no overall majority, then, of course, it's a bit strange to expect that any one party's manifesto would be implemented absolutely in full. Because if you're having to have different parties working together, then you have to have some degree of compromise. And do you know what? I don't actually think the public has a difficulty in understanding that. In fact, most people I meet don't find themselves to be a paid-up supporter of one party or another and say, I agree with absolutely everything that party says. Most people I meet think, well, I like what that person says about that issue, and I like what that person says about that issue. And they quite like the idea that actually sometimes politicians might have to work together constructively and find solutions to the problems that the country faces. That's exactly what we've had over the last 5 years. Has it been difficult for my party in some areas where we haven't been able to do some of the things that we set out in our manifesto and wanted to do? Yes, that has been difficult and challenging. But we have been able to make a difference to help people by cutting their income tax, to protect pensions, to get more money into schools for the poorest pupils. And you come into politics to change things, and that's why I'm glad we've done that.
All right. I will come to you. I'll go to the woman with the scarf there.
I don't think we need electoral reform. I think we need honesty. I work in the NHS. Where does the money come from? It's very simple. We just want a bit of honesty from all of you.
Okay. The man with the beard and no spectacles, yes. You're easily recognisable by the beard, yes.
I'd like to know how much input Nigel Farage actually had into the UKIP manifesto, because he said last night that he'd read it, but I'd expect him to actually have some input into a manifesto, seeing as he's your party's leader.
You think he just accepted what others had written for him? Douglas Carswell.
If only. No. Like all parties, the leader has a big input, but it's a collaborative effort. Suzanne Evans, who was the chief architect of the manifesto project, was the main author, but she had input from all sorts of people. I had a small contribution, others had a contribution, but, you know, we're pretty collegiate in UKIP, and there are lots of party spokesmen and women who've got all sorts of ideas to contribute, and they did. And I think one of the extraordinary things about the UKIP's manifesto is not just that it's been independently costed, but it's coherent. It's all about change and dispersing power away from unaccountable elites and cliques and pushing power outwards and downwards. And I think it's a coherent, incredible document.
Douglas, it's also about portraying this country as Little England, anti-foreigner,
absolutely not.
Wanting to keep all the foreigners out.
Absolutely not.
Let me ask you this.
Absolutely not.
Let me ask you this. You have avoided responding to something that Nigel Farage said the other day, which was when he went on his big rant about, you know, our parents wouldn't get hospital beds because foreigners coming here with HIV would be soaking up our money. Now, the reason I think you've avoided this is because your own father is one of the most eminent researchers into HIV in the world. Yes. And I would like to ask you whether you felt ashamed of what Nigel Farage said about the stigmatisation of foreigners coming here with such a crippling, awful disease, and whether you feel happy that he is trying to get himself elected on a ticket of don't let these people come into this country.
Let me...
Because I don't.
Let him answer.
I think it's entirely legitimate and right that we should expect that our National Health Service is a national health service and not an international health service. Now, if someone was to fly into this country with no prior connection here at all, and to fly in specifically to access treatment to which they weren't entitled, I think most people would accept that that is wrong. Now, but hang on, and I feel this, I grew up in Uganda in the 1980s, and I feel very strongly about this. The story of HIV has also been a story of enormous progress. Advances in medical science, for which I think we should celebrate. People now have access to retroviral treatments, which mean that people who 20 years ago, people that I knew who had very short life expectancy...
Why would Nigel Farage
isolate
HIV as a stick to beat people with? Why stigmatise those people?
Can I finish the point? I think that prejudice has been overcome in Africa and here and throughout the world, and that's something to celebrate.
So why increase it now, then?
But it's entirely legitimate that during a election campaign... It's entirely legitimate that during a campaign you can raise the issue of how we pay and whether or not our health service can bear the cost of treating people for whom there is no other...
Let me just put this to you. We talked about your father, and he was obviously in the van of the treatment for HIV. And Nigel Farage went out of his way to talk about HIV rather than other things, infertility treatment, all sorts of other treatments people come here to get. He said, you can come to Britain from anywhere in the world and get diagnosed with HIV and get retroviral drugs costing up to 25,000 a year. We've got to put our own people first. Why did he pick on that?
You need to talk to Nigel about.
Well, you
why
talk to him more than I do, and you must have asked him this.
I think it's entirely legitimate to make the point that our National Health Service is not an.
So you weren't embarrassed in any way about what he said?
I think it's also important to point out that there has been enormous progress in fighting this terrible disease, and I think that is something that we should celebrate.
But more than 1 in 4 doctors working in the NHS have come from overseas.
All right,
he didn't mention that. He only chose to talk about HIV patients and to stigmatise them.
All right. Let's turn. I'll come to you, Angus. Let's turn to the NHS. It came up partly in the debate tonight, but it wasn't one of the main questions we took. But Jake Suett has a question, which I'd like to go to next.
Thank you, David. In view of Sir David Nicholson's comments today about the financial state of the NHS, do any of the parties have realistic plans for the future of the health service?
Yes. Sir David Nicholson, who'd been in charge of the NHS, said a substantial financial problem and said that nobody was facing it in this election. Grant Shapps, do you accept the strictures that made the publicity today?
Yeah, he actually, if you listen to his interview this morning, went on to say that we had some plans which were perfectly reasonable and deliverable, because what Stephen Simons, the current Chief Executive of the NHS, has asked for is £8 billion, and we are actually, I think I'm the only person on the panel here from a party who's agreed that we will fund the NHS to that amount in the next Parliament. So that is something that we've actually pledged. It's a commitment from Conservatives.
It's a cry from the right that they have too.
Well, no, we will do the same in the next Parliament as we've done in this. It's just increased resources on the NHS, and that's in stark contrast to what's happened, as was pointed out in the debate tonight, in Wales, where I think I'm right in saying the NHS has been cut by 8%, the only place in the country where the NHS is run by Labour.
Jo Swinson?
Well, actually, Liberal Democrats are the party that have set out a costed way in which we can give that £8 billion. In terms of Grant's party, this is £8 billion for the NHS, not costed, on top of their £7 billion tax cuts, their £6 billion right to buy, the free holiday in Bali for people I'm expecting next week. You know, the Conservatives seem to have thrown any kind of thought that they need to cost their policies entirely out the window. I'll set out the £8 billion very clearly.
No, but wait a minute. Deal with Sir David Nicholson first of all, because he said no parties had got the answer to this, or prepared to grapple with it.
I think he's made the very clear point that funding is a key issue for the NHS. His successor, Simon Stevens, has set out the £30 billion that the NHS needs and said that he believes, although challenging, that they can do another £22 billion through efficiencies within the NHS, and that leaves £8 billion that needs to be found in additional funding, and that's this £8 billion figure that everybody's discussing. We've set out very clearly.
So why is David Nicholson going on about no parties facing it if you've got the solution?
I think to be
fair,
the Labour Party have said £2.5 billion, and the Conservatives haven't put any costings next to their £8 billion. As I say, we're...
Well, hold on a minute. First of all, we've already done what Stephen Simons asked us to do for the next year, which is £2 billion, which we have funded. This £8 billion, to be clear, is by the end of the next Parliament. So we're talking in 2020. When you bear in mind that during this Parliament we've increased to £7 billion a year, and we start from a healthy economy rather than from an economy which was as bust as Greece 5 years ago, I don't think there's anything impractical and unreasonable about an £8 billion pledge, and we're the only party who's making it.
No, you're not the only party that's making it. That is just not true, Grant. Liberal Democrats have done it, and actually we have also set out the taxes that we would change and raise in order to pay for part of that, through changes to capital gains tax, through getting rid of the Shares for Rights scheme, and also we're the only party that's saying we'll balance the books by 2018, which then means we can use the proceeds of growth to invest in the NHS, whereas your party, Grant, will keep on cutting, and Labour won't have balanced the books by then.
The man in the white shirt there on the gangway.
Yes, I'm a final year medical student, and I'm going to be joining the NHS in August as a doctor. And I don't really see why the parties across the political spectrum, along with kind of the leaders in healthcare in our country, can't sit around the table and come up with, I don't want to steal the phrase from Grant Shapps, but like a long-term healthcare plan for the country. Because I think our NHS is something we should really be proud of, and it's something that's too precious to be used as a political football, and kind of each new successive government to come in and make sweeping changes, and nothing ever seems to be kind of concrete and set kind of long-term
constant argument.
thinking.
Piers Morgan, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. It's very important when you have this debate to talk up the NHS. You know, I live a lot of the time in America where they have a completely different system. It's incredibly punitive. Many people who should get free healthcare do not get it, and it's a shambles. We have an amazingly good system here. The problem with the NHS, and the reason why none of the parties are getting credit for their plans, is because their plans always come with, we're going to give you more nurses and more doctors, and it all sounds all happy-dancy and fantastic until you get to the reality of the NHS economy in isolation, which is that it's riddled with debt. And actually, the kind of money they're talking about is a drop in the ocean to simply pay off the existing debts and deficit within the NHS budget. And anyone who works in the NHS knows that is the problem. So what they want to hear from the parties is a clarity about how you deal with the existing debts of the NHS before you start promising the electorate to try and get elected yourselves a load of pie-in-the-sky stuff about doctors and nurses and all the other cliched promises that we have to hear. Sort out the real problem, which is debt within the NHS right now.
Right. And, Angus Robertson, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, you probably know this quite well, said the Scottish Government has chosen to protect the NHS in Scotland slightly less than it's been protected in England. English spending will have risen by 4% in real terms. Scotland has fallen by 1%, 2015-16.
Spending in the NHS... Well, first of all, important to point out the NHS in Scotland is a different NHS to the NHS here in England. And since the SNP has been in government, we've increased spending on health in Scotland from 9 billion to 12 billion.
So different in what way?
Well, the improved investment in the National Health Service in Scotland. And while Piers is right to highlight the issue of debt, which I'm going to come back to in a second, it is also important to acknowledge the role of people who work in the service, the fact that there are more nurses, there are more consultants, there are more doctors, all of that
so what's the Institute for Fiscal
Scotland.
Studies on about, then, when it says you're spending less than the...
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, because the numbers that are there show that the investment in the NHS in Scotland has gone up. But Piers has raised an issue of debt, which is very important, because this relates to the failed efforts of effectively privatising large parts of the NHS in England. It's the PFI schemes that were brought in, the massive overinflated costs, effectively, of a credit card to pay for the building of hospitals, the building of schools, and so on. And then, in parallel, the ever-growing percentage of the NHS in England that was becoming privatised. And that's where we need some honesty about what's coming down the track, just as there were earlier questions, because we need honesty from the Labour Party and we need honesty from the Conservative Party, both of which parties have pursued in their own ways at different times in government, increasing privatisation of the NHS. And I don't think the majority of people want that in Scotland, and they don't want it in England either.
The SNP as well. Which is what your party has done. And you're talking about honesty, but the Institute for Fiscal Studies made it crystal clear, particularly in the run-up to the referendum, you were obsessed with independence, you took your eye off the ball, and NHS funding in Scotland was cut, and you had the gall to try and suggest that the NHS was somehow at risk in the referendum, when actually the government at Westminster had been increasing funding.
Can I remind you
Let's not. No. I don't want to refight. I want to refight the referendum. The man in the blue shirt there.
I was just going to say, the NHS, it's such an important thing to everyone in this country, and I'm sure most people who earn a salary would be willing to pay an additional £20, £30 a month if they knew that money would be going directly to the NHS. And
all right. And the woman here on the right. You.
Yeah, when you consider that it takes 5 years at £9,000 a year to train medical students, and then that NHS staff have been on pay freezes for many years, it's an open question. What do you propose to do to increase the number of doctors?
And Douglas Carswell, maybe you'll take on board what the man in blue said.
I do think the NHS is incredibly important. In my part of Essex, there's a chronic shortage of GPs, and that's one of the reasons why the £3 billion extra that we would give to the NHS, and we've set out how we could afford that, would be dedicated to training more GPs. One of the things we would do to make sure we got more GPs was, number one, to make sure people studying medicine at university didn't have to pay huge tuition fees and debt upon graduation. The second thing we would do is, sometimes if people have been out of medicine for a while and they want to go back in, they have quite high costs to re-register. and we would make sure that those costs were met for them. This is about removing the barriers to entry to make sure we get more GPs. And I think it's vitally important we do that. In my constituency, there are people who've paid into the system all their working lives, and they can't get to see a GP. UKIP will keep medical care free at the point of use.
Douglas, there's an important thing to recognise in the NHS, which is that there's a very high percentage of staff working from the wards right up to the consultant level who have come from other countries. And we owe a huge debt of gratitude to them, as we do to everybody else in the NHS. How can you possibly say that your plans are going to be beneficial to the NHS when you're wanting to send people away from this country? They are not. These are not compatible statements.
One of the reasons why we need an Australian points-based system is precisely so we can allow people to come here with the skills we need. And one of the skills we desperately need are people with GP qualifications and people who can work in the NHS.
Yvette Cooper.
The NHS does need more money, and it needs it now. It's been pushed into crisis. We've seen people waiting longer and longer to get a GP appointment. You ring up at 8 in the morning and you can't get an appointment. We've seen longer waiting times for treatment, and particularly more and more people waiting for longer at A&E. And also hospitals struggling to balance their books. So it needs money now, and what David Nicholson was saying today was that actually we can't wait. We can't wait for 5 years for IOUs from Grant Shapps. We need investment now. So it's an important question, though, but it's an important question about where's the money going to come from.
Are you pledged for the 8 billion?
So we would set out a mansion tax, a levy on the tobacco companies and other tax avoidance measures, and raise £2.5 billion extra for the National Health Service to be going into the National Health Service next year.
Is that for doctors and nurses, or for that?
This is for doctors and nurses.
So it's not for the 8 billion?
No, but because
it's separate, is it?
It's to go straight away in, because the point about the NHS is it needs more doctors and nurses.
Where are you on the 8 billion that he's talking about?
Because the 20,000 nurses is important. That is what the NHS does. At the moment, the NHS does not have enough staff to do the job.
Have you got the 8 billion or not?
Grant Shapps doesn't have the 8 billion.
No, he doesn't have it.
But we will arrange the
No, he doesn't have it. He doesn't have it.
We have said...
No, he doesn't have it. He just keeps saying, oh, well, we'll somehow come up with 8
billion. Hold on a minute.
It's not just a magic monetary. It's an entirely
As he said, Piers said, you're at risk of losing everybody. Your audience at home and your audience here with this chup, 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 chup. I mean, I think we get the point. Thank you. They say they're going to find 8 billion. You say they haven't said how they're going to find it. End of story for the moment. Let's hear from other members of the audience, but just your comments, please, and I want to go on to another question. I'll take the man in spectacles, I think, at the very back.
Me?
Don't know why we... Yes, to your right. That's it.
Thank you.
Yes.
I am an NHS doctor, and I completely agree with my colleagues who've made comments. I actually find it very depressing, the bickering going on, because it's very bad for staff morale. And healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, allied health professionals are being worked to the bone. We do need a massive injection of finance, because what do the public want at the end of the day? Do we want a universal healthcare system that's the best in the world with short waiting times? We can't do that. We're losing doctors. We're struggling to recruit GPs. And actually, I just find it, the outlook is quite poor.
And when you listen to what's being said by the various parties in the run-up to this election, does that give you any comfort?
Well, they talk about 8 billion, they talk about 12 billion. It's a sticking plaster at the end of the day. The original question my colleague asked was about the long-term vision, 10, 20, 30 years down the line. What do we actually want?
A lot more money?
If that's the case, are people prepared to pay for that? I would be prepared to pay for that, but someone needs to take that decision so we can actually sort out the NHS and not keep putting sticking plasters on it.
So, just to clarify, yes. So, from your point of view, you need more money, but you don't want it to come from taxation, but from direct contributions.
I would be happy for it to come from taxation. It sounds like other members of the audience would agree with that.
All right. And the person over there on the right. Yes. You.
I'd just like to echo, I think, what the gentleman was saying. I'm genuinely concerned that the NHS is not sustainable in the future, as we're saying 20, 30 years down the line. We talk about other countries, people dying because they're not able to afford healthcare. I'm genuinely concerned that in the UK, people will die because they'll get to a hospital and there won't be enough staff to help them. There won't be a hospital bed. They won't be able to even get in the doors. I recently, unfortunately, had to go to hospital, and I've never seen a hospital so busy. I've never seen staff had to work so hard, and I'm just worried it's not a sustainable thing. And we're talking about putting money in. It's obviously very difficult in the financial situation to get this money. It's all a bit up in the air. I'm genuinely concerned that it's not sustainable.
All right, and I'll take one more point for the person there. Yes. Yes, you. The woman with her hand up.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about the fact that no matter what the problem is, Labour seem to want to fix it with a mansion tax, pay off the debt as well as make guarantees. I don't understand how any of that is feasible, and I think it's really irresponsible.
All right, well, I think we'll go on. You mention a mansion tax that might bring us to housing, if we've got time. We have, I think, got 10 minutes. Just a word, we're going to be in West Bromwich next week. The week after that, we're in Leeds for this rather special programme with 3 of the party leaders. So if you want to join us, either West Bromwich or Leeds, there's the address on the screen, the telephone number goes along with it. Let's take this question from Marek Wiloshinsky, please.
Right to buy has proved to be a popular policy. Just because it's popular, does that make it right?
Just because the policy is popular, does it make it right? And, of course, we've got the Housing Association announcement by the Tories. All right, Yvette Cooper, let's not be too long-winded on this. No criticism. What's your answer?
The principle's a good one. People should have the chance to be able to buy their own home. But if it's going to cost £4.5 billion and they haven't identified anywhere that that money is going to come from, what that means in practice is that there will be fewer homes to rent. And we've got an affordable housing crisis, particularly in London. We can't afford to lose £4.5 billion worth of homes. And that's why I think that this is the wrong policy. It's not going to be good for the economy, it's not going to be good for housing, and it's certainly not going to be good for affordable housing that people desperately need.
OK, Marek, do you think it's a popular policy, presumably? Do you think it's a wrong policy?
It's popular with some people, I think, people who perhaps bought their properties, but people who are waiting for social housing or for just the general condition of the stock that's left behind, it's not good for that.
Grant Shapps?
I think it's both popular and right, actually. And one of the things that is so good about this new policy is it's, first of all, fully costed. You'll be able to fund this policy by selling the third of the most expensive houses, council houses, and then using that money to provide the discount for somebody in a housing association to buy their home and to rebuild at least one home, one for one. So you don't lose homes. It's not like the very original right to buy. You not only someone gets to buy their home, they also get to build a home to satisfy somebody off the housing waiting list.
It's a complicated
policy.
Why did you wait until the election campaign to announce it? Why wasn't it there a year ago or 2 years ago?
Look, just because it's complicated, probably blame a former housing minister. I mean, that's probably the answer, and I was one of them. But look, just because it's complicated doesn't mean it's not right. And the truth of the matter is, the right to buy has been very, very popular since the beginning. Labour tried to kill it off by doing away with the discounts. I reinvigorated those. This has been a process to answer your question, David. I reinvigorated those with the Prime Minister back in 2012, since which time a lot of people have been able to purchase their own homes through the Right to Buy scheme. Now we want to give the 1.3 million families who live in housing association homes and do not have and have never had the right to buy, because they're funded in a different way, that right to buy. And that is great for those people. It means they get to live in their own home, which they've purchased, and realise that aspiration.
What do you think of it?
For me,
you, sir, in the white T-shirt there.
I think...
No, not you, the person behind you. I'll come to you. Oh, you've also got a white T-shirt on. I'll come to you in a moment. The man behind you in the white T-shirt. And then I'll come forward a row, 2 rows. Yes.
I'm not sure how we're to believe that one-for-one houses are actually going to happen when there have actually previously been promises of that, but it's run at about 10%.
Do you think it's a popular policy in principle or not?
I think it's popular. I think it's popular, but I think the majority of people don't realise that there's such a crisis with social housing stock.
Not only... OK, hold on. The lady in front of you, 2 down. Yes.
I work in social housing, but I also live in an affordable housing scheme. So for me, it seems great. You know, I can buy the scheme that I live in. But a lot of my friends haven't had the opportunity to live in a scheme that I do. I pay 80% of the rent for my property, so I can save to buy. What happens when I buy my property and then no one else has the chance to live in a scheme like that?
Cutting to the chase. If the Tories come back and this policy is introduced, would you buy your own property?
No, in principle, no.
On a matter of principle, you wouldn't. Piers Morgan.
I think it's not the right to buy, it's the right to bribe, isn't it? We're basically being tossed a little bribe 3 weeks before the election. It all sounds great, and we're all going to be house owners, and that's great. I've nothing intrinsically against the idea of right to buy in the right circumstances, but it seems to me it's chicken and the egg. It's the wrong issue. The issue now facing so many young people in this country is how to get on that first rung of any housing ladder. And, you know, one of my sons said to me yesterday, an interesting thing, it's not statistically provable, this. He said, do you know what, Dad? He said, it might be that 90% of my generation never get to own their own house. Now, that probably is not going to be true, but it's the fact that he would even think that and that his friends think that, I think is a real concern in this country. And the reason why they think it is because successive Labour and coalition governments have simply not built enough houses. And they've got to build more houses.
Very well. Angus Robertson. Of course, housing is devolved to the Scottish Government.
Indeed it is, but we're in front of a London audience, and I find it difficult to understand how many people working, I don't know, in the health service or for the police or in teaching can frankly afford to live anywhere in London. And the idea that the answer to this housing crisis is by bribing people, effectively, for their votes, to pursue what is a perfectly understandable dream, which is owning your own property, but at the cost of everybody else who can't get on the housing ladder, because it's a Ponzi scheme. There's no way there's going to be like-for-like replacement in the social housing scheme, and I think that's hugely irresponsible. In Scotland, we have taken away the right to buy because we want to protect the social
Nicola
sector.
Sturgeon's parents buy her own house through the council right to buy before
if you let me finish, we have built approaching 5,000 council homes in contrast to 6 under the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party when they were in government.
So your party leader buys her house.
30,000. If you let me finish.
Nearly finished, because we have only got a couple of minutes left.
30,000 houses are being constructed by the end of this Parliament in Scotland. That is the right way to go about it. Let's not put the cart before the house. Let's not put the cart before the horse. Let's make sure that people who can't afford their homes can get homes.
Right, I'm going to cut you off because we're coming to the end.
That's the important priority, not the other way around.
All right, thank you very much. And the comment from Grant Shapps, you no doubt heard but didn't respond to. Jo, your turn.
Well, I think the lady in the audience hit the nail on the head, really. I mean, this is a popular policy if you're one of the lucky few that it might be able to be helped by it. But, of course, there's many people who are renting privately that this will not do anything for, even though they want to buy a home. And, of course, it doesn't help that wider issue of housing stock. And I think, you know, over many years, successive governments haven't built enough homes, and that is part of the problem. And we need to take a range of different measures, and we've set out the need for more garden cities, helping councils to be able to borrow more, to be able to build more homes that we think will help with this. But I have to say, I did think it was breathtaking in the debate tonight with Nicola Sturgeon when she stood there and she said, we should build 30,000 more homes, we should do this, we should do that. You know, she has been in government for 8 years and she has seen a reduction of 11,000 social homes at a time when the coalition government has increased the social housing stock.
I'm going to have to stop you, I'm afraid, Jo. Mr. Carswell, it's your last minute.
When another politician comes along with a policy that I agree with, I think I should come out and say I support it. And I do support this policy. I've been spending a lot of time talking to people who live in housing association properties in Clacton, who are very excited about this policy, and I strongly support it. But I do think to address the problem of a shortage of social housing, we should do the sort of thing that my local council started to do, which is to rebuild new stock of council housing. And I think we should look to do that, and I think that is the answer, part of the answer to the problem.
Well, my apologies to those of you who've got your hands up. It's late at night, and we have to end our programme because our hour's up, and there's another one to follow us. So I should just say before I go that next week we're going to be in West Bromwich. On the panel, William Hague for the Tories, Paul Nuttall for UKIP. The Green Party leader, Natalie Bennett, will be there. Now, the week after that, we're going to be in Leeds for this special programme with the three party leaders. David Cameron, Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg will each face a question time audience in turn. And that's going to be an hour earlier than usual, 8 o'clock, live here on BBC One. So to be in the audience for either programme, that's West Bromwich next week or Leeds in a week's time for that special programme, apply by going to our website. There's the telephone number and the address. If you're listening on BBC 5 Live, this debate goes on. As you know, I wish it could go on here because there's a lot more to talk about. But Question Time, Extra Time on Radio 5 Live will continue it. Thank you to all of you on the panel who came here, and particular thanks to all of you who sat through the whole debate, everything that followed, and then contributed to this edition of Question Time. I'm very grateful to you from Limehouse in East London. Good night.
Further reaction to tonight's election debate from Andrew Neil and guests next on BBC One with This Week.
The general election on the BBC, bringing you the news as it happens.
Wherever you happen to be, online.
And on your mobile.